All right, well, kia ora koutou. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Thanks for giving up your time for such an important subject. Really looking forward to coming around and talking with all of you later on in the session. My work is principally as a journalist and author. I write a lot about inequality and poverty. A lot of my work is going around and talking to people in deprived neighbourhoods about the kind of lives that they lead and why those are the way they are. And doing things like this, I often think of the story of Kelly, a woman who I interviewed for my first book on inequality. And Kelly was a single mother of two living in Auckland, and her life story was really just a series of barriers that were put in her way by society at large, both private and public sector, which were very difficult for her to surmount despite putting in the most incredible amount of work that anyone could hope to. So when I first met Kelly, not long before that, she'd been living in a flat in central Auckland that was so damp that when you walked on the carpet in your socks, your feet got wet. Terrible, damp, mouldy, awful housing. So she moved, particularly to find a better house for her kids. But to do that, she had to move all the way out to Propoor. But she wanted to keep her kids in the same school because that was really important to her, that their education not be disrupted. So every day she had a 2-hour trip to get from Propoor to her kids' school and then to work, incredibly badly paid work, and then 2 hours on the way back. So 4 hours of travel a day, very poor public transport, couldn't afford a car. Life very, very difficult. Then all sorts of other things, very badly paid, as I said. And then IRD and Ministry of Social Development contrived to mess up her entitlements so that she was underpaid by $4,000, which they didn't set up with her until the end of the year, which is pretty crazy when you think about how much you need just week to week. She got, was terribly badly treated by her employers and also by other private sector organisations, so that on one occasion her daughter had an accident, she had to call an ambulance. Her cell phone reception was terrible. The ambulance only just arrived in time, took her a long time to get through. When she rang up Vodafone to complain, they said, "It's your fault because you don't have a landline," which is not something that they say to people like me or my parents who live in nice, wealthy suburbs. So lots of barriers in Kelly's way. And the two things that I always think about when Kelly's stories come to mind is first that her issues were caused by big structural things that were not under her control as an individual, things that we have to fix together. And the other thing that really struck me is that income and wealth mattered. It was the lack of income that meant Kelly had this incredibly difficult life, lack of wealth, no assets behind her to tide her through the tough times. It was a lack of those things that a year or two ago meant that she ended up, the stress of trying to deal with this whole situation, she ended up with a complete physical breakdown, so bad that the doctors who dealt with her said, "You look like you've had third-degree burns all over your body." Just total physical breakdown. And I think we in telling this kind of story, we have to focus right in on the lack of income, the lack of wealth, because we can go down a whole lot of pathways. We can, with no disrespect, we end up talking about whether people have too many balconies on their flats. But the reason that people are in poverty in New Zealand is because they don't have enough income. They don't have enough income to achieve the dreams that they have, to fulfill the goals that they have for their own lives and for their children's lives. And we know that income is incredibly powerful as well. I think a lot of you will be very interested in education and the role of the education system. But the best, most recent analysis shows that if you want to boost someone's school results, spending $1,000 by just giving it to their family gives you the same boost in school results as spending $1,000 in the school system. And that's because fundamentally people want the best for themselves and their kids, provide income to families, they spend it well, they spend it on things that their kids need. So income's very important. And if income's very important, then the question is, why do so many people have so little of it? And I thought the graph that Eric showed earlier was very interesting, showing income gains for lots of different groups since 1950. And if you look closely at that graph, and you'll all have a chance because I know that slides are being provided, what you'll see is two quite distinct periods. From about the 50s through to the 80s, the income gains go very largely to people at the bottom. So you've got a pro-poor economy. What has happened since then, since the 80s, is that story has flipped around. And in the last 30 years, with some differences along the way, we have built an economy that delivers a disproportionate share of growth to people at the top. As an example of that, for the people who are in the poorest tenth of the country, who weren't on the graph that Eric showed you, their incomes since the mid-80s have barely increased at all. And in fact, if you take into account housing costs, those people have less income than they did in the mid-80s. Conversely, incomes in the upper echelons have increased 80% or doubled. Now, as to why that is, like I said, that's not fundamentally about individual effort. Kelly's story, which I think is an exemplar of the wider one, shows you that it is fundamentally about how things are structured. And so the answer is, well, with that background, how do you go about tackling those big picture structural things? Well, I think we can, and I would agree with Ganesh that there are not big trade-offs to be made. I think the evidence shows you that you can tackle poverty and inequality and actually have greater economic growth. As a result, that's what comes out of the latest research from not just the IMF, but also the OECD. And we see that from the record of the societies that have been best at tackling poverty, which are typically the Scandinavian ones, are also ones that have had very, very strong economies over the last 50 years. Now, part of the reason that you can tackle poverty without having any negative effects necessarily around the economy is that you don't have to go straight into what government does. I think if you want to get right down into the core of what causes poverty, there are what you might call the twin blades of the scissor. There's what happens with work, and then there's what happens with government and benefits. And one of the things that we know about the last 30 years in New Zealand that's seen this increase, this doubling of child poverty, for instance, is that the share of all the income that the country generates every year that goes to people ordinary workers, people who rely on wages and salaries, that share going to ordinary workers has decreased very significantly. Eric had a figure for, I think, the median wage of about $22. The average wage, which is a bit higher, recently was about $28 an hour. That would be about $35 an hour if the people who rely on wages and salaries had maintained basically their share of the income that the country generates. So that's a huge difference. $7 an hour, that translates to an enormous amount every year. And when you think about, and if you ask the question, the direct relationship that has to poverty, well, we know that of all the children in New Zealand who are in poverty, and that's probably 240,000 on one of the key measures, a third of them have a parent who is in full-time work. Half of them have a parent who is in some kind of work. So just getting into work, if it ever was, is clearly no longer enough to get you out of poverty. And that is in part because wages are so low, and that is in large part because people are no longer have not maintained their share of the income that the country generates. Now, in terms of how you deal with that, there's a whole lot of different ways. You could do it legally through increasing the minimum wage or strengthening the protections in law for workers, but probably the most flexible way is to acknowledge that the reason that people aren't getting the return on their work is because they don't have much power in the workplace. The average person doesn't have a lot of power to negotiate with their employer, whereas employers wield significant power. So the first blade of the scissor, actually improving the income that people get through work, I would say is principally about strengthening the bargaining power that people have in the workplace, because that's where incomes are handed out. Second blade of the scissors then is in terms of what the government does and what it does through benefits. And again, we know that the countries with the most generous welfare systems are the ones that see people move into and off benefits the quickest. Because again, provide people with the income that they need, they will generally do sensible things. They'll invest in whatever the training they need in order to get themselves back on their feet and back into work. So there's a good case for a more generous welfare system to lift people out of poverty, to give them a solid foundation, no matter what their situation is. Again, there's a whole lot of things that you could do on that front, but just to signal out one of the things that's happened in the last 30 years is that wages, although they haven't increased as much as they should have done, have increased. Benefits, once you adjust them for inflation, so you take out the effects of inflation, haven't. They've been absolutely flat, apart from the increase announced in the latest budget, since 1991. And the consequence of that is that people who are reliant on benefits have fallen further and further behind everyone else in New Zealand. And one logical way you would tackle this is simply to link the standard benefit to the average wage. There would still always be a significant gap, but at least as the economy grew, as living standards improved across the board, everyone would benefit from it. So those, for me, are the two blades of the scissors: boosting the in-work stuff and boosting the out-of-work stuff. And that's about tackling income poverty. And I think that's really crucial to give people the resources they need to tackle their day-to-day problems week to week, month to month. But you also have the issue of wealth. And I sometimes use the metaphor, if income is a river, it's a thing that flows, it changes from day to day, week to week. Wealth is the reservoir. It's the thing that the river flows into and accumulates and builds up as. And the reason that the reservoir, the level of wealth, matters is that that's what you use to build for the future. It's what you draw on when times get tough. It's the thing that really allows you to make plans for the future and improve your life in that bigger picture. And one of the issues is that the vast majority of New Zealanders have no significant amount of wealth at all. I know from the work that I've done that when it comes to the wealth distribution, the wealthiest tenth of the country own more than half of all the assets, half of all the wealth. In contrast, the poorest half of the country have less than 5%. So very significant numbers of people with no real wealth stake that would allow them to do that long-term thinking right out the tough times. How do you deal with that? One potential way that was implemented in the UK a little while back is effectively a match saving scheme, particularly for kids whose parents are never going to be able to invest in them in the way that they would like. And so what you do is you say to those parents, look, if you basically enroll your kid in KiwiSaver from when they're born, from then on, for every dollar that you put in up to a certain amount each year, the government will match that. So you've got an incentive for parents to save for their kids, the government's matching that. That money is sitting there and it's accumulating interest. And even with very small rates of contribution, you can end up with kids hitting 18 with a wealth stake of $10,000, $11,000, which they're then restricted to using for other wealth-generating purposes like investing in a house or a business or saving for their retirement. Those kinds of things start to help deal with wealth poverty as well as income poverty. Now, I'm running out of time, so I'll be brief on the last two. I think the first three things there are absolutely core, and that's about tackling people's basic lack of material resources. If you're going to do a couple of other things that help break cycles, help increase people's opportunities in the long term, I would say boosting people's health is a really key one, because if you're in poor health, it's very hard to pull yourself out of poverty. And I think one of the biggest and most obvious drivers, and has already been alluded to by Eric and others, is the role of housing. Housing is extremely expensive, and it is also in incredibly poor condition. I don't know how many of you know this, but New Zealand is internationally, and I don't use this word lightly, I would say a disgrace in terms of the quality of our housing stock. In other developed countries, it is not normal that so many houses are damp and mouldy. It is not normal that they are in such poor condition, so badly insulated. It is not normal that so many of them are in such terrible condition. So I think a significant house building program to a high standard and a warrant of fitness to ensure that all rental housing is at a certain standard will do a huge amount in the long term to tackle poverty. Finally, you have the issue of poverty traps, the sort of things that trap people like Kelly in cycles of poverty. I won't talk about this much. I hope Diane Robertson, who was here earlier, talked about this. The evidence is a lot of families who are in poverty are dealing with very significant issues around finance, very expensive finance, very poor access to credit, and I think tackling that would do a huge amount to break the cycles of disadvantage, and increase people's opportunities in the long term. Thank you very much.